Hey guys, welcome to another Nerd Morning episode. My name is Jeremy Miller, and today we are talking about the difference between heroic and iconic characters. So, I think that a lot of people think of heroic characters when they think of characterization. A heroic character is an individual like, say, Bilbo Baggins, who goes on an adventure and changes, right? So, Bilbo, here he says, I want to stay in my little hobbit hole, I want to live and just relax, and that's just kind of how I'm going to live my life. And all of a sudden, Gandalf sweeps him up into an adventure, and he changes from being the original Bilbo who wants to stay and not have adventures to being a individual who can fight and who has seen the world and has done all these different things, and he comes back home with treasure and with this new sense of being, a new sense of self, and he is not the same person from when he begins. I think it's a really, really good example of a heroic character. I think when we read a lot of books, we have all these character-driven stories. We have them in sci-fi and fantasy predominantly, in a lot of the types of things that we see as either readers or writers. We talk about progressing as a character, to change, and that we're supposed to be growing. But honestly, that is a lie. We need this in many, many stories, totally. But there's another type of character and story system, and that is the iconic character. So, Batman is a great example of what I mean by an iconic character. So, Batman, he goes in at night and he battles, I guess, the forces of evil, generally speaking, criminally insane individuals who go in and pillage and plunder and kill and create all sorts of crazy mysteries for him to solve. Batman is a great example of what we mean by an iconic character, because we're not really seeing him grow and change. You can pick up many different stories of Batman and read them out of order even, and they're going to make just as much sense because Batman stays, relatively speaking, the same. And this is an example of an iconic character. So these are things that we are going to definitely dive into more, but kind of begin with that foundation. A heroic character is someone like Bilbo Baggins who grows and changes, and an iconic character is someone who pretty much stays the same. So they are somebody who is consistent on their character, and we're seeing more how they react instead of how do the characters change. So let's go in a little bit more to heroic characters and kind of their examples. So, Star Wars, specifically Luke Skywalker. So Luke is a heroic character. In fact, he follows Joseph Campbell's hero's journey almost to a T. This is a good example of someone who he's out there in his farm, and he wants to go and see the world and have adventures, but really he's just a farm boy. And he goes and then changes and progresses and becomes ultimately a Jedi. And he is this epic, fantastical sci-fi hero. And we see that type of thing in The Wheel of Time, in Aragon, and lots of other stories where you pretty much have this farm boy. They get tapped on the shoulder by destiny. They go on this grand adventure and they change. And that is a really good example of that. Another one I think of that's in pretty prominent pop culture is Katniss Everdeen with the Hunger Games. Again, she is this hunter, but she just is hunting to survive. She lives in this small town, and then she's tapped on this shoulder by destiny, and she gets thrown into the Hunger Games. She then has a lot to battle, to overcome, in order to be able to be the person that she needs to be in order to survive. And then she ultimately becomes this symbol of change, and from that, she is able to enact the changes that she needs to in order to be able to make it through the story. And this is a good example of a heroic character because there's so much growth, there's so much change in who she is. Harry Potter is another really, really, really good example of a heroic character, right? So, young Harry Potter, he lives in the world of suburbia inside of England, and he is tapped on the shoulder by destiny. He says, they said, "You're a wizard, Harry." He goes, "Wow, this is amazing." Goes into this fantastic world, Hogwarts, and meets his friends, does all those types of things, grows, changes, learns magic, and ultimately is able to confront the Dark Lord. So this is a good example of a heroic character who grows, who shifts and changes and has to in order to be able to have that story succeed. So in this, the story model is that we want to see how do the events change the character. And as a reader, we wanting to see the character grow. That's some of the stuff that pushes us and propels us to the end of the story. The climactic moment in the story is going to be the proof that the characters has changed because they respond to the things based on the skills and the things that they've learned throughout their experience. And so Harry Potter is a perfect example of this. They do that so well. So that is heroic characters. Swinging back to iconic characters, iconic stories are more episodic in nature, where hero's journey is really good for fantasy, for sci-fi, YA novels, all those types of things. Iconic characters are really, really good for episodes. An episodic story is something that you go in, you have this experience, and then you can go in for the next episode. And these are obviously really, really good for TV shows, comics. A lot of people's favorite comedy TV shows. You can watch them out of order, and you're going to be okay. Again, comics, they can do that really well. But they don't, not necessarily just in those, but those mediums are really, really good for it. So we talked a little bit about Batman. Batman's a really, really good example of a iconic character. Another one from the world of comics is Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is, again, this strong, powerful symbol, and I think iconic characters are icons, right? They're symbols. And she's the symbol of bravery, of truth, of strength, of femininity. She's all these types of things, and we want to see that symbol. We want to see that symbol do things, and we just simply want to sit back and watch how these characters respond and react to the things that are put in front of them. But we know ultimately that at the end of the story they're going to be reset to the status quo and they're going to be able to kind of move forward. Another really, really good example, this one from literature, is Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes doesn't really grow and change. He is a character who is investigative, and he's trying to figure out and solve a mystery, but it's not about Sherlock Holmes changing or growing. It's about the mystery itself. It's about how, who the whodunit and how that all gets to come together, and how Sherlock Holmes is going to uncover that because of who Sherlock Holmes is, not because of how he's going to change. So that is another really good example. Another one, James Bond, 007. James Bond, most of all of his stories and his books and in his collection of movies, he's the super spy, and we see how he responds to that. But we know, James Bond is the guy who can, is quick with the trigger, good for an action sequence, maybe has a beautiful woman on his arm, but he is not somebody who's making huge life-changing progressions. I think some of the newer series, they kind of blend that a little bit towards the heroic, where they do have him grow and change. In fact, Skyfall is an example of one that has a bit of an exception with that. But kind of for a rule of thumb, James Bond is a character who stays the same, and he's consistent. And we know exactly what we're going to be getting in a James Bond story, particularly, again, with the books. Another character, Superman. Superman is an iconic character. He's like the icon of all superheroes. He is, generally speaking, a very, very consistent character. And in fact, I would say to the point where sometimes Superman is not as interesting because some of the writers don't recognize that the things that make Superman interesting is Clark Kent, not necessarily Superman, because he's so powerful, he's so strong. But really, a Superman story is the super powerful, godlike character going in, confronting some alien, some apocalyptic power, and he has to then respond and react to those things. We know that Superman's going to be victorious in the end of the day. We know that he's going to be able to overcome. That's not really what we're wondering. We're wondering, how will he react? What is he going to do that's going to solve this problem? And that's, again, another reason of how those things are iconic. Another great example of an iconic character is the one and only Indiana Jones. He is an amazing, fantastic character that is consistent. He really is the same from beginning to end. And as he goes through his adventure, what we're trying to see is, how will he react, not necessarily how will he change. So that is a good example of, again, an iconic character. So heroic characters, they change, they grow, and we like to see the story's events change them and have them progress from where they were before to where they can become. An iconic character is somebody who we just want to see them do the things that they're good at doing. We want to see them be themselves. And we don't really care about them changing or growing, but we want to see, what are they going to do, how are they going to respond. So those are kind of my two extremes, right? We have the heroic characters on this one side and iconic characters on this other, but it's not necessarily black and white. In fact, Bones is a TV show that I absolutely love. It's super great buddy cop narrative, I would classify it under. And we have these two characters, Booth and Bones, and they go out and they solve these murder mysteries, and they use their two different skill sets in order to be able to do that. And ultimately, each episode, we kind of get the murder mystery of the week, and they go in and they solve the mystery, right? That's very, very iconic. But they also are going to grow and change. In fact, these people, spoiler alert, end up having a relationship together, and it's one of the best buddy cop to romances I've ever watched. They do a phenomenal job. But Booth, he has to grow and change in order to be able to have them be successful in that relationship. And Bones, as well, has tons of growth that she needs to do. And ultimately, that growth is very, very small. It's very, very gradual. It's not necessarily what the story is about, but as the story progresses, because there's so many seasons, it becomes more and more about the characters and how they're growing and how they're changing than it is about the monster of the week kind of story. So it shifts kind of from being iconic to being a little bit more heroic because there's levels of growth. So this is one that kind of sits maybe in the middle. Spider-Man also is one that I think kind of sits in the middle. Because he's a teenager hero, he has a lot of things that he has to do to grow up. He starts off in middle school, and he ends up, in college, graduated, married. All of these types of life changes grow and change the character. And Spider-Man then, though he also has kind of the bad guy of the month and battles and figures out how he can deal with those characters, he also has a lot more character growth and is allowed that because of the nature of his person. So he kind of sits in the middle, and I think that's an important thing to realize as well, because we kind of have these two camps, heroic and iconic, and we say, I see some people say, we have heroic characters, every character needs to grow and change, and people say, well, no, there's these examples of how they don't grow and they don't change, and there's these iconic characters, but that's not necessarily the truth. There's maybe a little of a blending and bleeding, in most of the characters that we'd see. And there's another, I think, really good example of how this can break the mold, and that is origin stories. Origin stories can do a lot of growth because they have to start from the beginning to where they're able to be at the end as an iconic character. And where someone like Luke Skywalker or Bilbo Baggins, they start in the small little town and they have this basic person, and then they go and they reach all this potential and they become the hero of the land or whatever. The whole story is them growing and growing and growing and changing. Origin stories serve that purpose, but in a really tiny section, a tiny piece. And we could have a whole story of an origin story, and then from there on, they're iconic characters. An example of this is with the Nolan series of The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan has obviously that filmmaker background. Filmmakers really, really gravitate towards the heroic characters, where maybe TV show people gravitate maybe more towards the iconic characters. So origin superheroes are seen a lot inside of the movie medium. But with Batman Begins, that is a story of, Batman becoming Batman. So he starts off, if we were to take everything that's non-linear in the story and take it out linearly, we have young Bruce sees his family being murdered. He's in the super low point. He then decides that he wants to go and discover the world, understand how he can fight crime. He goes, he struggles, he experiments, he gets thrown into prison, he gets taken by Ra's al Ghul, it's pronounced Roz in the film, and then learns how to be a League of Shadows member, decides that he's going to be a hero instead, returns to Gotham, puts on the mask, figures out how he's Batman, and by the end of the story, he is Batman. He's able to do everything the iconic character can do. And we see this growth from this young boy all the way to the hero. But afterwards, he's Batman. And so origin stories are kind of an exception. Another example we used as well for an iconic character was Superman. But Smallville, the entire series, is him becoming Superman. Right? So, he starts off, he's a freshman in high school, he's struggling, trying to figure out life, he's picked on, he's developing an ability, and then, a little bit later, he develops a new ability, and he has all those types of things that gets him towards that place to be Superman. But he also has to change as a character because he's has to become an individual that could be out in the open as Superman. And this has obviously iconic elements to it as well, because you have the monster of the week, but really the whole premise of this is him growing and changing to be able to be Superman. So it is an origin story. It's him progressing, shifting, and changing to be the type of character that he needs to be that iconic character. So I think when we look into our stories, I think sometimes we need to see, is this a heroic story? Is this an iconic character? Are these types of things going to play into how this story is going to be told and interpreted? I think this is really useful for people who are writers. I think this is really good for people who are readers. And I think that this is just an interesting way we can understand characters and how different characters do different things for different stories. I am a super fan of all of these type of characters. That's why we got to pull them up and talk about them. And I can see how both of these type of elements work really, really well for their purposes inside of the storytelling medium. So I guess kind of in the end, kind of looking at that, both heroic characters have their place, iconic characters have their place, and they can all be really amazing, lovable characters. So if you guys liked this video, let me know, put them in the comments below. That would be awesome. Please be sure to subscribe That's going to help me out a ton. And also, if you like the video, make sure to give us that thumbs up. Also, you can find me on both Instagram and on Twitter at Nerd Morning. So be sure to like, subscribe, and follow on those places as well. If you guys have thoughts about other videos that we could be doing and talking about, let me know as well. I'd love to get that feedback of things that you want to hear and have us talk about. And beyond that, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more upcoming videos.